The 4 focus areas for our plan are certainly to have an adequate supply of emergency shelter and outreach programs in the state. We know that there are not enough shelter beds in Maine. There are a little less than 1,000 emergency shelter beds in Maine, and that's for all the different kinds of populations who seek shelter. That's for youth, it's for single individuals, families, victims of domestic violence, the whole range. On the other hand, we don't believe that building more shelter beds is the answer. We believe that finding solutions that are about permanent housing with appropriate supports are the answer. Because if we have 2,000 shelter beds, we will probably fill them. But then we will be spending our resources on Band-Aid measures and not on the permanent solutions for folks. So that is always creating a tension for us. Do we have more shelter beds because we know there are people going out unsheltered, and yet we also know that the biggest need is a permanent place to live with support. So it forever creates a tension for us. Clearly, we need an adequate supply of appropriate housing and rental subsidies. And I know I said a minute ago we have plenty of housing. Well, that's true in some part of the states. It's certainly not true in every part of the state. So we need the adequate housing. But even if we have 2,000 places for people to live coming out of homelessness, if we do not have rental subsidies, they still won't be able to live there. So we work always on the rental subsidy issue. We know another focus area for our plan is making sure that people's health needs are met. That's perhaps one of the most challenging because we're talking about people's physical health, their mental health, chemical health when there are substance abuse issues. They're complicated issues for people, and I know Trip Gardner is going to speak a little bit later about some of the challenges of providing health care to the homeless populations. And then the fourth sort of prong of our plan is really to make sure and to try to make sure that the issues underlying homelessness, besides some of these other things that I've talked about, are addressed. They may be issues of lack of employment, or they may be issues of lack of education and training in order to get employment. It may be the need for learning better ways to manage small money, whether a person has almost no money or has a little more. It may be for some of the folks who come through our system the need to have representative payee services, for example, to help them manage the money that they do have. So addressing all those issues, it's big, it's complex. Have we come as far as we want to in the last 5 years? Absolutely not. But I think we're moving in the right direction. I would say some of the one significant thing that has happened in the last 5 years is the people are sitting down at tables talking to each other and, more importantly, listening to one another. When I came into my job almost 5 years ago, one of the things I was told is, oh, well, this group over here, they don't even speak to each other. So how are you going to resolve homelessness in that particular area? Or I would often hear people, we all beat up on each other, I think, when we're not, sometimes things aren't going as well. And so I would sit at tables with homeless service providers who would be talking about how bad DHHS is, for example. Or I would sit at tables with DHHS folks who say, those darn shelter providers. And, you know, the list goes on and on. We can all think of groups where we do that. And I think one significant thing we've accomplished over the last few years is I hear a lot less of that. And I really see people coming together to say, we have problems to solve, and this is a community, it's a local community problem, it's a state government problem, it's a federal government problem, it's a nonprofit problem, and let's all sit at the same tables and work on the best solutions that we have. We have a whole array of other accomplishments, which I'm happy to talk about at breaks today or with other folks. The last one I think I would mention that the statewide council was instrumental in working along with Cindy and other folks at Maine Housing is that we did 2 different cost studies of what it costs when people are homeless and on the streets, people who have disabilities are homeless and on the streets or in shelters, and how many public dollars are we spending compared to when we help people get permanent housing with the supports they need. And the results are dramatic. I can provide you links to get copies of those reports if you haven't seen them. But we are spending significantly less public dollars when we help people get housing, supported housing, get the kind of services and supports that they need. We're spending a lot less money, but the best news is people have a much better quality of life. People have a place to call home. And we did that cost study in the greater Portland area, and then we expanded it statewide, and we went into many of the rural areas of the state. And we did that looking at what did it cost in public dollars the year before somebody got housed, and what did it cost the year after they got housed. And it was always less money, and the quality of life always skyrocketed. Then we said, okay, that's the first year, but did people really stay in housing or not? So we looked at the same population for their second year in housing, and we were amazed. Our results here in Maine were significantly higher than they have been around the country. Around the country, folks who get into permanent supportive housing, people with disabilities, primarily mental illness or co-occurring disorders, it was something like 70% of folks stayed housed in the second year. Here in Maine, almost 90% of our folks stayed housed in the second year because they were getting the kind of supports they need. So the last thing I'll leave you with this morning is just to tell you a little bit about the scope of homelessness here in Maine. Last year, in 2009, 7,100 different individuals stayed in homeless shelters here in Maine. Now, we know that that is not everyone who is homeless. That is simply the people who found their way to a shelter and for whom there was also a bed, because often people get turned away. We don't have all the beds. But 7,100 people stayed in shelters here in Maine. About 53% of our shelter bed nights are in Region 1, York and Cumberland counties, which you would probably assume because that's our heaviest population area. About 20% of homelessness, the shelter homelessness, is in Region 2, the middle swath across the state, and then about 27% is in Region 3, the Penobscot, Piscataquis, Aroostook, Washington, and Hancock counties. 11% of the folks in 2009 who stayed in shelters or safe homes came in as victims of domestic violence and stayed in one of our domestic violence, were served by one of our domestic violence agencies. 6% of the population last year was under the age of 24, and 7% of those staying in shelter were veterans. And you'll hear later today more about both domestic violence and veterans populations. We know the veterans population experiencing homelessness, for example, is much higher than 7%, but 7% is who make their way to the shelters. So, we have one other thing that's significant in Maine this year, and it is in every state in the country. Maine received $8 million this past year to deal specifically with homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing, and it came through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. So in every county of the state, we have agencies who have received money very specifically to either house people who are experiencing homelessness and get them rapidly rehoused so they're not languishing in shelters, or for the first time ever, we have money to prevent homelessness. And we are working on keeping families and individuals housed who are at imminent risk of homelessness so they never enter our homeless population. So both Cindy and I can talk to you about that if you have questions throughout the day. So my time is up. I am looking forward very much to learning all that you and our speakers this morning have to share. So have a great day, and I'll look forward to chatting with many of you.